Senator Gorton.
Mr. MacGaffin, I follow the compliments Mr. Benveniste. I look at these 11 points as the most precise and substantive and
Microphone.
I look on these 11 points as the most thoughtful and decisive and pointed suggestions that we've had to solve a very real problem. They've taken a great deal of thought and effort on your part and are the result of a great deal of experience. Now, generally speaking, when you get a compliment like that before the question, there's a but.
However.
And this is the but. I go through this with great care. I listen to all three of your brutal criticisms of doing something like MI5, and now I want to ask you how this differs from MI5. It seems to me that what you've created here is two essentially separate entities, maybe housed in the same place. But you will have a head that is appointed by the president, and really when you get right down to it, he's going to be picked by the president, and he'll consult with these other three people in doing so for a fixed term. His personnel are going to be separate from the other FBI personnel. You're going to start with the 60% FBI people, but they will be trained and will go through a career entirely in this intelligence function. And you don't get together at least until you get to the level of the Attorney General, though I see little supervisory authority in the Attorney General here. And I look at what we've learned about MI5. Well, it's separate from the constables and law enforcement in Great Britain. They finally reach a point at the Home Secretary level, is the first place that there's a real contact between them, who in turn is a creature of the Prime Minister. So, with all respect, except for the fact that you call these people FBI agents, my first question is how it differs from a separate entity such as that in the United Kingdom or in some other place. I strongly suspect that you will have at least some sharing of information challenges between the old FBI and the new FBI. That's number one. Second, there's been bitter criticism here of saying that you might have exactly this same kind of function, except maybe that it works up through the CIA to the president rather than through the Attorney General to the president. But what we have from a point of view of communicating with one another and solving the fundamental problem is that here in this situation, housed in the FBI, however you do it, you are mixing an intelligence function with a law enforcement function and a cultural clash that you have testified to only too eloquently. If you were dealing with a domestic CIA, you wouldn't have a culture clash. You'd have to have an entirely separate organization like this one because the rules would be so different. But it would be intelligence, and the problem of communicating with law enforcement. Here you have an intelligence and law enforcement mixed, and still nothing to increase the communication between the present CIA for intelligence overseas and the domestic intelligence that this new group is going to take, with the fact that the terrorists move back and forth across the borders with a relative degree of ease. So that's sort of a long speech. But haven't you given us an MI5 just simply with a different name? And is it so totally out of even our line of consideration that we should have all intelligence with two separate sections under one head, rather than have that split between domestic and foreign, face the split between intelligence and law enforcement?
First, and it's going to sound like I'm ducking, and I'll come to some of the other issues later. The first and most important part is the fact that it is in the FBI is our first proposal, serves to root it in the tradition of America, in the great tradition of getting John Dillinger and whatever, the great confidence the American people have in their faith.
It's a good
That
point.
is a very, very important thing. Something I learned about it that I didn't appreciate in my 31 years at CIA, but came to appreciate in my 6 years at the FBI. Terribly important. So the fact that it's there is, number one, a very important difference. It's not a new organization. It's what's new is it's going to go about doing its business differently in a different form. It's going to truly do intelligence collection that it doesn't do now. Comment on the relationship of the AG to this. You alluded to that in your remarks. There is an analogy in the Executive Order 12333, which is essentially guides how, in my old world of the CIA, how what is the approved and appropriate practice with regard to, in this case, U.S. persons. The guidelines themselves were crafted and approved with full input by the Attorney General, but on a day-to-day basis are administered by the DCI and the Deputy Director for Operations. I can't tell you how many times I had visitors that come out to John MacGaffin in Beirut or Baghdad or wherever it was and gave me and my staff, here, do you really understand 12333 with regards to, I think that we need to do the same, some version of the same thing here. To John Henry's very well taken, the Attorney General has to have a firm foot in this, but not necessarily in the day-to-day management of what collection is done, but certainly has to set up, and we've got to all be satisfied that the constitutional protections are there when the collection is done, if I make that point. The communication, the last point you made was how do this deal with the question of communication across the intelligence, the great intelligence law enforcement divide. Again, while we've made progress in that since 9/11 with a club over their heads, the level of non-communications within the existing FBI across criminal and intelligence, national security sides is unbelievable at times. I mean, literally, I was present when the person responsible for doing Russian organized crime met the person in the bureau responsible for the national security side of pursuing the Russians, and I knew them both. What's this all about? So it's not that there is this great free flow of information across the internal workings of the bureaus that exist now. That's a fallacy. Mm-hmm. It should be. I mean, the bureau ought to be built on all the information that's appropriately available where it needs to be, but it doesn't work there now. So I guess that'd be my third point, is that it's the ability to build this communication across law enforcement intelligence. The intelligence community would welcome and work with an organization like this embedded in the FBI that was clearly doing collection work, because then it's easy to say, here's the problem, it's Al-Qaeda, I'm going to do Paris and something else, and you're going to do, and that'll work. And when we've done that between the two, it is a winner. And when we haven't, you get what we got.
One brief question. Mr. Barr, do you buy into the MacGaffin formula?
Not completely. I do think ultimately this will evolve into two directorates within the FBI. I think it's a far different situation than having a separate agency, because I don't think Mr. MacGaffin expected these two entities to be hermetically sealed. They would be interacting and coordinating in the field, in the field offices, all the way up the chain. One thing to remember is, again, collection in the United States relies on law enforcement assets. During the first Gulf War, when I was responsible for American counterterrorism, a lot of it boiled down to tracking people, figuring out where people were in the United States or where they were going. And that required a lot of stakeouts. It required a lot of traffic stops. It requires, going into stores to find out where certain apparel was bought. It requires going into hotels to check records in an entire city. Very intensive, requires feet on the street, law enforcement people. An MI5 type agency, I don't care how many agents you put in it, it's not going to, you're either going to have 20, 30, 40,000 agents running around the United States if they're specialized and dedicated, or it's going to have to be integrated with law enforcement assets in the United States. The FBI today has those assets. It is integrated with state and local law enforcement, 650,000 police. And they do a lot of the work necessary to track down terrorists. In sharing information, any division, even a division within an agency, will create sharing problems. It happens at this, at the much ballyhooed CIA. But in fact, if it's in the same agency, the risks are lower. You usually get more sharing of information. The coordination with the CIA is something that happens. The FBI is part of the part of the intelligence community, and that coordination has to occur. And in that case, it's with entities outside the Department of Justice. But I don't think we should compound the problem by creating another fissure, this artificial distinction between law enforcement and intelligence collection.
What part of MacGaffin's recommendations here do you disagree with?
Well, I'm not sure I would be so prescriptive. In other words, from my experience, institutions, will evolve over time and develop appropriate cultures. For example, take the CIA. When I was first there was, some distinctive culture between the DDO, Directorate for Operations, and the DDI. And yet, most of the career intelligence people came in through the CT program. They got the training of the covert people, even though they might ultimately end up over in the DDI. That's not to say there were other ways for people to come in. So I think, there'll be some things where you may want some overarching program where you get some basic law enforcement orientation for people. But I think eventually you will end up with two directorates. But I don't think we should, necessarily make them, hermetically sealed against each other. Some cross-fertilization is a good thing.